is Reason Revolution. I'm your host, Justin Clark. Thank you so much for joining us this week. This week is going to be a little informal. It's a really fun little show I'm going to be doing in between weeks with guests. I had a guest that canceled this week, and so I'm just sort of doing a impromptu podcast about some of my favorite books. I'm going to be sort of giving you a top 10 list of some of my favorite books related to atheism and skepticism and humanism. But before I get into that, I'm going to talk a little bit about just kind of my life and what's going on lately. So hopefully I sound a little better for you guys because I just got a new microphone. I'm really excited about it. It's a little bit better. It's a little bit nicer. So I'm looking forward to making sure that you guys can hear me a little bit better, and hopefully you do, and hopefully you like it. Let me know what you think of the sound and any way I can improve it. A lot has changed over the last week or so. My wife and I have just moved into a new apartment. I'm finally in my new office, which hopefully will be a little more quiet. We'll have a little less noise in it, and will hopefully be a good place for me to record podcast episodes, both just as ones by myself and the ones with guests. So I'm really looking forward to using my new office. So as I said, this episode is going to be called The Atheist's Bookshelf. And I just want to outline how much I love books. I'm a bibliophile. I have hundreds of books at my home, and I love them. I think that books are incredibly important. I think books are what allow us to transfer knowledge over the generations and to really liberate ourselves from ignorance and from superstition and from all kinds of harmful ideas, and teach us a lot of good things, a lot of new things that are valuable to us as skeptics and as humanists. So I'm going to give you guys a top 10 list tonight, and I'm also going to share with you some quotes from those books, and we'll kind of unpack it a little bit. Let's get started with number 10. Number 10 is The Atheist Muslim by Ali Rizvi. Ali is a really cool guy. I've spoken with him a couple times over social media, and I absolutely loved his book. I read it last summer. I gave it a pretty glowing review on Goodreads, and he really appreciated that, and I'm really glad to have been able to help sort of plug his book a little bit. So it pretty much tells Rizvi's story of growing up and sort of slowly abandoning his religion. And it also is, I think, a criticism of both Islam as a doctrine, as well as the ways in which people in the West, roughly speaking, or people in the United States or Europe kind of think about how to deal with some of the issues regarding Islam, particularly Islamist extremism, terrorism, things like that. And he gives, I think, a pretty compelling case, as does Ayaan Hirsi Ali in a lot of her books, particularly her most recent work, Heretic, about the need for sort of a reformation, a Islamic enlightenment or Islamic reformation, if you will, and calling for a commitment to human rights and secularism and tolerance. And so I think it's a terrific book. I think it's an excellent book that gives you a sense of just some of the doctrines that are in Islam that are probably a little more unsavory. I think it's a great crash course for people like myself who did not grow up within Islamic culture and need to learn about the nature of how Islam will be a huge force in the world for good or for ill. And one thing I think he talks about that I really like in reference to talking about sort of how we deal with, anti-Muslim bigotry and things like that is he says something along the lines of, in the Middle East, particularly in the Muslim world, typically, Islam is viewed as a religion. It's a set of doctrines. It's a view of the world. Whereas in America or in sort of Europe, Islam is an identity. And the reason for that is that largely it's because the vast majority of people in those regions of the world are not Muslims. And a lot of them are immigrants. A lot of them are migrants. A lot of them are refugees. And when they come over, they do face, I think, some levels of bigotry. I have a friend of mine who was a colleague at my undergrad who was a Muslim. She worked in student affairs, and she wore the hijab, and she faced terrible discrimination and bigotry when she worked in my former hometown. And that's terrible. I mean, no one should face discrimination and fear their safety because of what they believe. But I do think it's an important note that Rizvi does have that clear distinction between understanding how we view Islam as a religion and how we view it as an identity. And a lot of times in in the West, we often sort of try to help those who are Muslim from facing bigotry precisely because they are sort of a minority and they're sort of a minority identity. And he sort of tells us to be cautious about that and the fact that, we have to be very careful about the ways in which we both critique some of the unsavory aspects of Islam while at the same time advocating for human rights and standing against bigotry. With that in mind, I'm going to pull a couple quotes that I think are really, really great of his that are, I think, relevant to this discussion in his book. One that I really, really love is, quote, "Human beings have rights and are entitled to respect. Ideas, books, and beliefs don't and aren't." And I think that's a really good distinction, that we should help those who are real people, facing real problems, and not be so beholden to protecting beliefs that are harmful, specifically because they may sort of belong to an identity that is of minority status here in the United States or in Europe. And then in relation to sort of the discussion between Islam as an identity and Islam as a religion, he says a quote here. He has, quote, "When liberals equate criticizing Islamic doctrine with anti-Muslim bigotry, it leaves a vacuum that is too frequently filled by genuine right-wing anti-Muslim bigots who are even more disagreeable, who get stuck in the middle. Ex-Muslims." And I think that's a good point. As an ex-Muslim, Rizvi has faced his own amount of both bigotry from people on the right, and he's also faced, I think, a certain level of the cold shoulder from people on the left, particularly when he does criticize Islam. And, for those who are ex-Muslims, people like him or Armin Navabi, who runs Atheist Republic, or Faisal Saeed Al-Mutar, who runs Ideas Beyond Borders, Sarah Haider, Mohammed Syed, these guys are the vanguard of a whole new generation of leaders who are no longer defending some of the bad aspects and the bad ideas of Islam, and they're standing for human rights. They're standing for freedom and for tolerance and for progress. So I think it's important that we understand that they're in a very precarious position and that they should be defended. I also do want to give a quick shout out that I think the Center for Inquiry, in conjunction with the Richard Dawkins Foundation for Reason and Science, is doing something right now that's essentially an underground railroad for ex-Muslims in the Middle East or in just sort of the Muslim world broadly, who, if they come out as being atheists, they can be either imprisoned or killed. And I think it's really great that there's a network of people here in the United States and in Europe who are helping those who are leaving their religion and help them flee from persecution and violence. So my hat's off to them on that for sure. And I think that Rizvi's book is absolutely terrific. I think it's definitely worth listening to or reading. I think there's an audiobook version of it, so I would definitely check that out. But yeah, it's a terrific book, and I highly recommend it. So we'll move on to number 9. Number 9 is Free Thinkers by Susan Jacoby. Susan Jacoby is an intellectual historian. She's a journalist. She's written a ton of really, really interesting, excellent books. One of her earliest that's sort of in this thread is a book called The Age of American Unreason, which is a terrific, terrific book about sort of the degradation of intellectuals in our culture. I think it's a very worthy successor to the intellectual historian Richard Hofstadter's excellent book, Anti-Intellectualism in American Life. She wrote it during the Bush years, but I think it's equally appropriate to what's going on now in the Trump era. Her book, Free Thinkers, is essentially a history of American secularism. She goes all the way back to the American colonies and then through the Revolution and through the history of the golden age of free thought in the 19th century, those exemplified by Robert Ingersoll, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Helen Gardner, and others who championed leaving religion behind in favor of humanism, progress, reason, and science. I'm going to give you a quote to give you a sort of sense of what she was sort of discussing in relationship to the golden age of free thought. So let's pull from the quote here. quote, "For if freethinkers did not have a political platform, they nevertheless agreed on a wide range of social, cultural, and artistic concerns, which generated such fierce debate in the decades after the Civil War that they would form a template for the nation's culture wars a century later. These included free political speech, freedom of artistic expression, expanded legal and economic rights for women that went well beyond the narrow political goal of suffrage, the necessity of ending domestic violence against women and children, dissemination of birth control information, a major target of the punitive postal laws defining birth control information as obscene that bore the name of Anthony Comstock." So he was a politician who was heavily critical of sort of indecency and things like that. The atheist and anarchist writer Emma Goldman was pretty critical of him as well. Opposition to capital punishment and to inhumane conditions in prisons and insane asylums, and above all, the expansion of public education. So this is sort of the broader sort of views of freethinkers in the culture during the mid to late 19th century. And I think it's pretty right. Her book is a wonderful, wonderful primer on the intellectual and political contributions of non-religious people here in the United States. And it goes all the way up to the present day for the most part. She has a terrific chapter on Ingersoll. She has a terrific chapter on the founder of American Atheists, Madalyn Murray O'Hair, and the sort of crusades and the successes that she had in getting rid of involuntary prayer in public schools. And I think it's a worthy read for anybody who wants to understand the American tradition and heritage of free thought, because it's much, much older than people often give it credit for. People think that sort of atheism is sort of a new thing, and it honestly, it really isn't. And I think that it's worthwhile to definitely read Freethinkers by Susan Jacoby. So that's my number 9. Number 8 is sort of piggybacking off of Freethinkers. It's a collection of lectures and essays by the late, great 19th century orator Robert Ingersoll. It's a collection of essays called The Gods and Other Essays. It was published a little over 25 years ago by Prometheus Books. It has an introduction by the humanist scholar Paul Kurtz, and it's a terrific, terrific little introduction to Robert Ingersoll as a thinker and as a public intellectual during the late 19th century who advocated for abandoning Christianity and religion in general and embracing reason, science, critical thinking, and humanist ethics. He wouldn't have called himself a humanist. That term didn't really exist back then, but he certainly was a humanist for sure. Ingersoll was born in 1833 in Dresden, New York. His father was a Presbyterian minister. He grew up learning a lot about religion, and eventually, after the Civil War, he served in the Civil War. He was a colonel in the Civil War. He was known a lot during his life as Colonel Ingersoll, or Colonel Bob, or Bob Ingersoll. He fought in the Battle of Shiloh, and when he eventually mustered out of the Union Army during the Civil War, his wife, who was a free thinker, his wife Ava Parker, who came from a long history of free thinkers in her family, really encouraged him to research more. And so he did. And over the years, probably the mid to late 1860s, he was an agnostic. Although he also described himself as an atheist. He was basically what you would call today an agnostic atheist. He's both. He saw really no distinction between the two. And so, honestly, he was both. But he was known more in the public as the great agnostic. And so he would give these huge speeches in front of sold-out crowds to thousands of people. He was a lawyer. He was a politician. He was personal friends with 3 presidents. He campaigned for every Republican presidential candidate, I think between Grant and McKinley, except for maybe one. And he was one of the most sought-after public speakers in America. And he was one of the most popular. It was him and Mark Twain during the late 19th century, Twain being another free thinker in his own right. And his lectures are just terrific. He's heavily influenced by Thomas Paine, so you can see the Thomas Paine influence in his writing. He has a really beautiful, eloquent style. It's certainly of its period in the way that it's written. But I just genuinely think he's an amazing, amazing man who did, I think, terrific things and was pretty bold for the late 19th century and was honestly celebrated for it. People showed up. People loved him. He died in 1899, and he continues to be an influence. For a long time, people didn't really know that much about him. But honestly, due to Susan Jacoby's book, The Great Agnostic, Ingersoll has sort of come back in vogue. And which is really cool because I think he's absolutely terrific. And my master's thesis from graduate school, my history master's thesis is on Robert Ingersoll. So I have written and sort of contributed to the intellectual discussion on him. And I'm very proud to have done that. And he was certainly an amazing subject to research and to write about. Now I'm going to share with you a couple quotes from The Gods and Other Essays. I think it's like 4 or 5 of his lectures. I think one of them is just called The Gods, which is sort of his take on sort of why humans believe in gods and sort of the origin of gods and things like that. He has a lecture in there called Individuality, which I think is terrific. It's all about, being, thinking for yourself and being a critical thinker and going against the grain. And it's just terrific. He has a great lecture on Thomas Paine, which is certainly worth reading. And then I think one on ghosts, which is kind of interesting too. So I'm going to share with you a couple quotes now. Here's the first one. Quote, "Progress is born of doubt and inquiry. The church never doubts, never inquires. To doubt is heresy. To inquire is to admit that you do not know. The church does neither." I think that's really good. I think that's a fair point. I think institutionally, churches often don't want their followers to really doubt that much, because if they did, then they would either relieve the religion or they wouldn't come all the time and they wouldn't make sure to keep putting money in the collection plate. So I think that's a really great quote, particularly about doubt. I think doubt is one of the central things about humanity that has been one of our greatest achievements, our ability to doubt, our ability to critically or just, nascently think about what we're being told or what we're learning, that that truth isn't with a capital T, as Seth Andrews says, that what we learn about the world is provisional. It's always changing. It's based on new evidence, and inquiring and doubting the conventional wisdom is always good. And I think it's important for us to do that as a culture. It's what allows us to progress. So I love that. And then I'm going to share with you one final quote of his. And this one has a phrase in it that he became very well known for and used many, many times, called the Happiness Creed. And you'll kind of hear where it is within this quote. So here we go. Quote, "Reason, observation, and experience, the holy trinity of science, have taught us that happiness is the only good, that the time to be happy is now, that the way to be happy is to make others so. This is enough for us. In this belief we are content to live and die. If by any possibility the existence of a power superior to and independent of nature shall be demonstrated, there will then be time enough to kneel. Until then, let us stand erect." And I think that's a really awesome quote. And there's so many of those from Ingersoll. But if you really want to get a great introduction to Ingersoll and sort of his thought and his ideas and the way he presented them to the public, The Gods and Other Essays is, I think, an excellent little book to check out. So that's why it's my number 8. Number 7 is about skepticism, and I think it's one of the most influential texts on skepticism that's really ever been written. There are a few other ones that I think are really great. One of them is an honorable mention from my list, Flim Flam by James Randi, which is all about skepticism and critical thinking and sort of debunking, even though Randi doesn't really love that word, but debunking sort of common myths or folk tales or superstitions in our culture. Another one that's really excellent, that's from the 1950s, but I think is relevant even today, is Fads and Fallacies in the Name of Science by Martin Gardner. And Martin Gardner, he was in a lot of ways one of the fathers of the sort of skeptic movement in a lot of ways. He's sort of one of the first modern skeptics. So definitely check those books out. But the book that I chose for number 7 that I think is incredibly important is Why People Believe Weird Things by Dr. Michael Shermer. Shermer is one of the most eloquent and provocative and, I think, champions of reason and critical thinking and science and humanism in the culture. And I'm so glad that he's got a new book out, which is really cool. It's all about like sort of the search for the afterlife and utopia. It's called Heavens on Earth. Any of his books are terrific. My favorite book of his is The Moral Arc, how science and reason can sort of help us understand morality and make our lives better. But why people believe weird things is, I think, classic in the literature on skepticism. And he sort of goes through the book and explains the importance of skepticism, and the importance of critical thinking, the importance of, not taking things at face value, really evaluating things. So he's got a few different really interesting chapters in the book. So he sort of does a lot of your classic debunking of like people who talk to the dead or think they talk to the dead, ESP. He has a really interesting chapter on sort of Ayn Rand and objectivism and sort of criticizing sort of the cult-like nature of objectivism. And he's got a great chapter debunking Holocaust deniers. And it's just an honestly terrific book. And I'm going to share with you a longer quote from the book that's either I think it's in the introduction, but it's a longer quote about why do smart people believe in such crazy things? People who are relatively well-educated, why do they believe in crazy things? So or weird things rather. So I'm going to read from the quote here. So, quote, "For those of us in the business of debunking bunk and explaining the unexplained, this is what I call the hard question. Why do smart people believe weird things? My easy answer will seem somewhat paradoxical at first. Smart people believe weird things because they are skilled at defending beliefs they arrived at for non-smart reasons. That is to say, most of us, most of the time, come to our beliefs for a variety of reasons, having little to do with empirical evidence and logical reasoning that presumably smart people are better at employing. Rather, such variables as genetic predispositions, parental predilections, sibling influences, peer pressures, educational experiences, and life impressions all shape the personality, preferences, and emotional inclinations that, in conjunction with numerous social and cultural influences, lead us to make certain belief choices. Rarely do any of us sit down before a table of facts, weigh them pro and con, and choose the most logical and rational belief, regardless of what we previously believed. Instead, the facts of the world come to us through the colored filters of the theories, hypotheses, hunches, biases, and prejudices we have accumulated through our lifetime. We then sort through the body of data and select those most confirming what we already believe, and ignore or rationalize away those that are disconfirming. All of us do this, of course, but smart people are better at it through both talent and training. Some beliefs really are more logical, rational, and supported by the evidence than others, of course. But it is not my purpose here to judge the validity of beliefs. Rather, I am interested in the question of how we came to them in the first place, and how we hold on to them in the face of either no evidence or contradictory evidence. I really love this quote because it gets to the heart of, I think, why skepticism is so important. Because we all have sort of views about things that are completely unsubstantiated. We just sort of feel them. They feel like hunches. They feel true. But we should really, I think, investigate whether they actually are true and make a more concerted effort to genuinely investigate things for good or ill. And I think that makes skepticism a very worthy pursuit, because if we're doing that, if we're going out of our way to genuinely try to understand an issue, then we research it, we go out, we do the homework, and more importantly, we evaluate the evidence. We don't just accumulate a bunch of evidence, we accumulate good evidence, we accumulate credible evidence. And so I think that's worthwhile. And I think that's really the important thing. And for me, I love the idea that, people who are really intelligent are very good at rationalizing some of the things that they believe. I think this is a great explanation of religious apologists, people like William Lane Craig or Frank Turek, who have created these sort of elaborate logical systems to defend essentially indefensible positions, and like the existence of God and things like that. So, it's pretty crazy to me that people who are that intelligent can make mistakes, but they do. And that's because we're human. And I think the value of skepticism sort of reaffirms why we have to be critical thinkers, especially in a culture that's filled with so much bunk and nonsense as ours. So number 7, why people believe weird things, Michael Shermer. I think it is one of the foundational texts of modern skepticism. So definitely check that book out. It's certainly worth a read. Number 6 is actually 2 books, but they sort of go together hand in hand, and they're both worth reading. God No and Every Day is an Atheist Holiday by Penn Jillette. Penn Jillette, of course, is the other half, the talking half, of the wildly successful magical duo Penn and Teller. I'm a huge fan of Penn. Without their show Bullshit, I would honestly not be the person that I am today speaking to you. They got me into skepticism. Without them, I wouldn't have gotten into James Randi. I wouldn't have gotten into Michael Shermer. I wouldn't have learned about atheism and skepticism. So I think that Penn is just an incredible person and certainly a huge influence on me. So God No is the first book. I think it's God No. I think it may be like Signs You're an Atheist or Other Magical Tales. I'm trying to remember exactly what the subtitle is. But it's basically a book of stories about his life. He talks about all kinds of stuff, whether it's... the one example he uses the most is harming his genitals with with a hairdryer, which is pretty funny. And Every Day is an Atheist Holiday is a book that came out either a couple years later or a year later, and it's sort of a spiritual sequel, pun intended, to God No. And I really just love both books. I think they're just excellent, fun reads. They're especially fun if you listen to the audio version because he reads them, and Penn is a terrific storyteller. So I love them. I think they're just really, really fun books that have both crazy, wild, funny stories in them, as well as, I think, some really good insights about what it's like to be sort of an everyday person who is an atheist, somebody who's not like a doctor, or somebody who's not a scientist, somebody who's not, a person who is of serious intellectual renown, but just a regular person. So here's a couple quotes from both books. The first quote is from God No, and the second quote is from Every Day is an Atheist Holiday. So the first quote is, "You don't have to be brave or a saint, a martyr, or even very smart to be an atheist. All you have to be able to say is, I don't know." And I think that's a really, really excellent quote, because it gets to the heart of what being an atheist is, right? So, for those of us who are atheists, we're also sort of agnostics, right? We just don't know whether or not the existence of a God is real or not. I lean on no. I don't think God is real. I think God is a myth. I think God is a manifestation of humanity. And I think it's important that, but it's important to sort of be intellectually honest and say, I don't know, rather than saying, oh yeah, there's absolutely this or absolutely that. Like, I think working in those sort of intellectual absolutes are a problem, but I really love that. I also love the fact that it gets to the point of that anybody can be an atheist, that, any average person, any average Joe or Jane can be an atheist. And I think that's true. And I think what's really great about what we've seen, especially over the last 20 years in our culture, is that more and more people are leaving religion. And whether they're explicitly atheists or not, I think it speaks to the power of skepticism and humanism and sort of atheism in the broader culture. And people just sort of being tired of religion. As a society becomes more educated and modern, it just leaves religion behind. And I think that's a good thing. So the second quote is from Every Day is an Atheist Holiday. So here we go. This is a little bit of a longer quote, but I think it's great. Quote, "The word holiday comes from holy day, and holy means exalted and worthy of complete devotion. By that definition, all days are holy. Life is holy. Atheists have joy every day of the year, every holy day. We have the wonder and glory of life. We have joy in the world before the Lord has come. We're not going for the promise of life after death. We're celebrating life before death. The smiles of children, the screaming, the bitching, the horrific whining of one's own children, the glory of giving or receiving a blowjob, sunsets, rock and roll, bebop, jello, stinky cheese, and offensive jokes. For atheists, everything in the world is enough, and every day is holy. Every day is an atheist holiday. It's a day that we're alive." And I love that. I think it's such an affirmation of life and an affirmation of what it means to be an atheist. Because a lot of people think, atheists, well, we're just nihilists. We don't believe anything. We don't care about anything. But in fact, we actually have so much to care about because we believe this is it. We think this life is the only one we're guaranteed to have. And so because of that, we want to sort of do everything and be everything and achieve things and love and live and to experience the beauty and wonder and amazingness, the wonder and joy of life. And I think that Pendulet's books are such wonderful affirmations of life and sort of optimism and happiness and finding what it's like to really live without superstition. Because to me, when you leave religion behind, it's a beautiful, freeing experience. It allows one to truly own their own life and to do with it what they will. I think that's worthwhile. I wouldn't want to live any other way. So I think that his books are just a wonderful affirmation of life, and definitely fun and funny and interesting and certainly not boring. I highly recommend them. Number 5 is one of my favorite books. It's certainly my favorite book by this particular author, and I've talked about this book before. It is The Moral Landscape by Sam Harris, and I love this book. I think it's his best book. I think it's my favorite book of his, and I've written about it. I've written about it for the site, and I really, I think it's terrific. What Harris is trying to do is allow us to truly use the new and emerging sciences of psychology and neuroscience and biology, what we learn in these fields, and sort of take those insights and apply them to how we can sort of address ethical concerns in the world. And he sort of creates this concept of the moral landscape. And so you have sort of peaks and valleys on the moral landscape. And it sort of reiterates a sort of new, if not new, but certainly reformed or sort of reiteration of utilitarianism with a little bit of virtue ethics thrown in and a little Kantianism for flavor, as when he's talking about sort of general rules. So I think it's just a terrific read, and it's certainly worth checking out. Even if you're not a Sam Harris fan, I know a lot of people aren't. I would say if you're not a Sam Harris fan, the first book you should ever read of his is The Moral Landscape, because I think it's his most well-researched. I think it's his most erudite. I think it's his most fully thought out and concrete, and I think it's terrific. So I'm going to share with you a couple quotes now from the book that I think sum up some of the really key insights that Harris has about understanding the relationship between our knowledge of science, what we learn from science, and how it can help improve our understanding of human values and ethics. So here's the first one. Quote, anyone who wants to understand the world should be open to new facts and new arguments, even on subjects where his or her views are very well established. Similarly, anyone truly interested in morality and the principles of behavior that allow people to flourish should be open to new evidence and new arguments that bear upon questions of happiness and suffering. Clearly, the chief enemy of open conversation is dogmatism in all its forms. I think that's absolutely right. I think it echoes some of the things that I've sort of been discussing tonight in other books, like Why People Believe Weird Things and other books, is this value of critical thinking, the value of holding positions tentatively, that you're open to new evidence, you're open to new ideas, you're open to new debates, you're open to new discussions. I think that's worthwhile, and I think it's the same thing with ethics. I don't think anything about ethics is set in stone. And I think that's a good thing in the sense that it allows us to improve our sense of morality. I think there are a lot of human universals when it comes to morality, like, don't kill, don't steal, don't rape. Those are, I think, pretty universal around all human cultures. But one thing I think is really interesting is how we really have started to change the conversation on how we as a culture, as a global culture, or just here in the United States or in Europe, how we're really improving the world and how we actively try to improve the world. And to do that, I think, is to really understand science. But I would also say it also relies on a key understanding of philosophy and of ethics. And using the two together, I think, is just an absolute imperative. And I think it actually broadens the conversations and makes them more rich and fulfilling. But I think it's important for us not to deny what we can learn from science in discussing ethical problems, because I think it's incredibly important that we do so. So here is the second quote. I think it's more specifically related to ethics, and I think it's one that's certainly worth sort of discussing in the context of this episode. So, quote, "Meaning, values, morality, and the good life must relate to facts about the well-being of conscious creatures, and, in our case, must lawfully depend upon events in the world and upon states of the human brain. Rational, open-ended, honest inquiry has always been the true source of insight into such processes. Faith, if it is ever right about anything, is right by accident." I think that's true. I mean, I think that faith is pretending to know what you don't. It's pretending to believe. It's believing in something without evidence, and you can sort of believe in anything if you're going to rely on faith. The beauty of open conversation, inquiry, rational discussion is that it allows us to really improve the ways in which we learn about the world and improve our way of life. And in order for us to improve our ethics, it requires, deep, thoughtful, and reasonable conversations about what we seek to want in our lives. So I love The Moral Landscape. I think I genuinely think it's his best book. And I would love to see, maybe him write a sequel or an expanded edition with new research. But I think it's certainly worth the read. Number 4 is probably one of the most, if not the most, read books about atheism ever published, ever. I think now at this point, there are probably millions of copies around the world. I'm pretty sure of that. And it's so popular and so sought after that even in countries where it's banned, like Saudi Arabia and stuff like that, there are sort of illegal bootlegs that people can sort of put out that are in Arabic. I think that speaks to how important the book is, and I could not have a list of atheist books without leaving it off. So my number 4 is The God Delusion by Richard Dawkins. You cannot talk about atheism in books without mentioning The God Delusion. I mean, it is one of the most important books in modern atheism, period. And it's, I think, for good reason. I mean, it is witty, it is biting, it is no holds barred polemical. It is brilliant at its best. And I read it a few years ago. I loved reading it. I thought, his blending of sort of his polemical style about religion mixed with his deep understanding of biology really gets to the heart of what he's trying to say about religion and how God is a delusion, that religion is a delusion, that we are deluding ourselves. And I think that for those getting into atheism and trying to sort of new to this space, I think that it's a book worth checking out and one that is certainly worth reading. I know Dawkins gets a lot of shit in our culture, but honestly, I don't understand it. I mean, I think there are certain things that are worth being critical of, for sure, but the book is strident. And I know that some people have criticized it, for not, he's like, well, he's not a religious scholar. Why should he be writing about religion? I'm like, to me, you shouldn't have to be like a PhD in religious studies to write about religion. I mean, I think anybody should be able to write about religion, and particularly somebody as well educated as Dawkins, who is one of the most influential scientists in relation to biology. And on that level, when evangelical Christians or creationists make claims about the world that are completely counter to evolution, and what we know about science, I think he's pretty damned well equipped to deal with those problems. So I think it's worth reading. I think it's a great book, and I'm going to share with you now a couple of my favorite quotes from the book. The first one is the very beginning of chapter 2. It is the quote probably best known from the book, and the one that, in fact, Dan Barker, former preacher and now the co-president of the Freedom for Religion Foundation, now a very public atheist, has written an entire book defending this one sentence because Dawkins got so much crap for writing this one sentence. And so Barker wrote an entire book breaking down, using his background in theology to break down just exactly how correct this sentence is. But it is controversial, but I love reading it. So here we go. Quote, "The God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all fiction. Jealous and proud of it, a petty, unjust, unforgiving control freak, a vindictive, bloodthirsty ethnic cleanser, a misogynistic, homophobic, racist, infanticidal, genocidal, filicidal, pestilential, megalomaniacal, sadomasochistic, capriciously malevolent bully." Now, damn, if that wasn't a badass sentence, I don't know what is. I mean, that is seriously a pretty damn polemical sentence, but I think it's pretty right if you actually read the Old Testament. I mean, the God of the Old Testament is really pretty much all of those things in terms of slaughtering people and letting people die and all of the horrible shit that he asks of some of his followers. So yeah, I mean, I think that the quote is, whether you have a religious studies or not, it's like at some level you can't take certain horrible things and just say they're metaphors. Like it's on some level, it's some of it's pretty damn backward. And I think that Dawkins hits on it with this quote. And then more importantly, I think that Barker, in his book, which is called, I think, the God, the most unpleasant character in all fiction, outlines just precisely how this quote is accurate. So I think it's not that controversial in my book because I think it's pretty accurate, but other people have different views of it. That's totally cool. But I think it's a great quote, and it's certainly a conversation starter, if nothing else. So here's the second quote. Quote, "There is something infantile in the presumption that somebody else has a responsibility to give your life meaning and point. The truly adult view, by contrast, is that our life is as meaningful, as full, and as wonderful as we choose to make it." And I think that's true. I love that. I mean, that kind of echoes a lot of the points that that quote from Penn Jillette sort of highlighted earlier, that when you're an atheist, your life belongs to you. It doesn't belong to the state, doesn't belong to the church. It belongs to you, and you do with your life as you see fit, and that you are the captain of your own ship. You are the sort of the author of your own story. And I think that that's the beauty of atheism. I think it's the beauty of humanism, is that we're not beholden to dogmas, we're not beholden to superstitions or myths, that we can sort of take from them what we will that are decent maybe, and then sort of apply them. But then we can do all kinds of other stuff. Of course, we rely on science, we rely on philosophy, we rely on the humanities as somebody who's an historian, history and art and literature and all those wonderful things. So, I think that living for one's own sake and having your own life is beautiful. And I think that when you become an atheist, you really get the chance to do that. So I think that Dawkins gets a lot of crap for being pretty strident, but he can also be pretty eloquent and I think pretty uplifting as well. And so I think The God Delusion is an essential read for atheism, and I think it's terrific. Number 3 is not just one of my top 10 atheist books. It's one of probably my top 10 books, period. It's a book that had an incredible impact on me when I read it a few years ago, and I love it. I think it's the single best book ever written about skepticism and sort of broadly science or critical thinking, period, that's in the popular culture, and I absolutely love it. It's Carl Sagan's masterwork, The Demon-Haunted World, Science as a Candle in the Dark. I think this book is his best book. I mean, it's beautiful. I mean, it's both poetic and affirmative of humanity, but also very critical of the ways in which we are fooled by nonsense, the ways in which we are dumbing down the culture. He's a great quote. I'm going to be sharing with you all about that. And I think that Carl Sagan has a real love for humanity, but this is his most pointed, and he really, I think, argues for science as a beautiful way of understanding the world and sort of defends science and critical thinking from a culture that both benefits greatly from science, but also doesn't know very much about it and tends to disparage it at times. So I'm going to share with you a couple quotes from it that I think one of them is pretty critical of our culture, and then one of them I think is actually pretty beautiful. So I try to do this with these books because I know they can be often very strident and very, very critical, and I think that's awesome and important. But I think it's also important to pair it with other things in the book that I think are uplifting and optimistic. So here's a quote that I think is unbelievably amazing. I mean, he wrote this back in, I think, 1995 or 1996. And the fact that this quote just has this, I mean, I know it's been making the rounds in the meme culture, about, Carl Sagan predicted, 2016 or 2017 or now 2018 or whatever. But I think this is a quote that strikes to the heart of, I think, what's fundamentally a problem with America. So here's the longer quote. Quote, "I have a foreboding of an America in my children's or grandchildren's time, when the United States is a service and information economy, when nearly all the manufacturing industries have slipped away to other countries, when awesome technological powers are in the hands of a very few, and no one representing the public interest can even grasp the issues. When the people have lost the ability to set their own agendas or knowledgeably question those in authority, when clutching our crystals and nervously consulting our horoscopes, our critical faculties in decline, unable to distinguish between what feels good and what's true, we slide, almost without noticing, back into superstition and darkness. The dumbing down of America is most evident in the slow decay of substantive content in the enormously influential media. The 30-second sound bites now down to 10 seconds or less, lowest common denominator programming, credulous presentations on pseudoscience and superstition, but especially a kind of celebration of ignorance." Wow, that's pretty powerful stuff. And I think he's right. I mean, the fact that we have a culture that benefits so much from science and yet knows so little about it. I mean, I'm somebody who doesn't have a background in science, but I've gone out of my way to read about science because I think science is important. Having some basic understanding of biology or psychology or physics, or just learning a little bit about the world that's not tied to just bullshit, allows us to be better citizens. It allows for better functioning democracy. The reason we have so many problems in our country these days is because we are fundamentally ignorant about so much. And if we learned a little bit more, if we spent time to genuinely learn about science and critical thinking and skepticism, or even just some basic knowledge, we'd be a better populace, and we'd be a better democracy for us. We would be less susceptible to charlatans. We'd be less susceptible to demagogues like Donald Trump. I think we'd be a much better society if we embrace those kinds of values. So I think Sagan is pretty angry that towards the end of his life, he's seeing that, he's worked, his whole life to educate the public on science, and some of it just wasn't sticking. And that had to hurt a little. But I think a lot of it did. And there's a whole generation of people, myself included, who have been greatly inspired by Carl Sagan. I never knew the man. He died when I was a kid. But I feel through his books and through Cosmos and through his ideas, I feel a kinship with him because he was so intelligent, but was never, I think, insulting to people. I don't think he was ever rude. I think he was just somebody who genuinely cared about educating people and had a very, I think, warm style that people could sort of kind of cling to. And I think that's really great. The second quote is, I think, a little bit more affirming than the first quote, but I think it's one that is interesting, and it's one that I think has been misinterpreted a lot. So I'm going to sort of give you my take on this quote. Quote, "Science is not only compatible with spirituality, it is a profound source of spirituality. When we recognize our place in an immensity of light years and in the passage of ages, when we grasp the intricacy, beauty, and subtlety of life, then that soaring feeling, that sense of elation and humility combined, is surely spiritual. So are our emotions in the presence of great art or music or literature, or acts of exemplary selfless courage, such as those of Mohandas Gandhi or Martin Luther King Jr. The notion that science and spirituality are somehow mutually exclusive does a disservice to both. I really love this quote because I think it gets to the heart of something that's very important that we need to do as humanists, which is to sort of rebrand spirituality. I know a lot of people don't like the word, and honestly, I didn't, but I think that having you read Sagan and I think reading Sam Harris's book, Waking Up, I think there's a way for us to sort of reconfigure how we understand spirituality that's purely based within the real world. It's not tied to superstition and nonsense and woo and religion. That spirituality is that sort of sense of awe, that sense of wonder, that sense of numinousness that we have about our place in the universe and our lives. That sense of joy of being a part of this amazing universe for a brief moment of time. The fact that, as Carl Sagan says, we are made of star stuff. That the elements that make up who we are were sort of forged in the depths of stars, and the fact that we are a way for the universe to know itself. These are all beautiful and poetic things. They also have the added benefit of being true, and that's, I think, one of the nice pluses about learning science, because science isn't just sort of boring facts and figures. History is the same way. Through learning about science, we learn about the world, and in learning about the world, we can sort of understand more. I remember the first time I really understood the impact of evolution. I was reading Jerry Coyne's book, Why Evolution is True, which is one of my favorites. It's certainly an honorable mention for this podcast. And he lays out a chart in the book about, hominids and how hominids go back millions of years and how we are tied into that sort of, tree of life, and how the hominids eventually emerge into, Homo erectus and others, and then eventually us. And just sitting there reading that and realizing that, like, I am a part of a huge story. The fact that every ancestor of mine was successful in mating, right? And that I am something that ties back millions, if not billions of years. Millions in the sense of hominids, billions in the sense of the first, eukaryotic cells. So I'm always in awe and in wonder of the things that I learn. Learning itself is sort of a spiritual experience for me. I love learning about the world. So yeah, I think there's a way we can take spirituality back from the nonsense and the woo peddlers and the bullshit. Maybe we just don't call it spirituality. Maybe we call it something else. For me, we can call it that. For me, it's just being humanist. It's just a humanism that I think is truly amazing. So The Demon Haunted World, terrific book. I could talk about it even more. He spends so much of the book debunking UFO myths. As somebody who spent an incredible amount of his life and career searching for extraterrestrial life, Sagan gives you a real deep dive in a sense of just how flawed UFO testimonies are, and just there's a possibility that there's life on other worlds, but chances are they haven't come here. I think that's really great. He also has this other couple things I'll mention in the book that are great. One of them is called the Baloney Detection Kit, which I think is really, really, really great, about some common tools that you can use to be a better critical thinker, to be a better skeptic. So I highly encourage you to search those out. The other one I really like is he gives a thought experiment called The Dragon in Your Garage. And he ties it back into the Baloney Detection Kit. So imagine someone tells you that there's a dragon in their garage, and you go, oh, great, well, let's see it. And they tell you, oh, well, it's an invisible dragon. Okay, well, then let's lay some stuff out on the floor, and when they step on it, then they'll leave a footprint. And the person says, oh, well, they float. They're not, they don't step on the ground. They don't have to. So we wouldn't leave a trace. But it does breathe fire. Oh, really? That's cool. So let's just see it breathe fire. We'll just see the fire come out of nowhere because he's invisible, right? Well, it's invisible fire. You can't see it. Well, we can probably feel it. It probably has heat to it. Well, it's also heatless invisible fire. And the lesson that Sagan is trying to give you here is a common fallacy that people use called moving the goalpost. And what it says is that anytime someone sort of debunks a claim, then they can just go, oh, well, it wasn't this, it was that. And I think what's important here is that using critical thinking to debunk things is incredibly important, but it's also important to acknowledge that, like, people are going to find their way to bullshit out of being honest with you. So be critical of what people tell you, and Additionally, know when you're being bullshitted. I mean, that's so the dragon in your garage is a really great example of sort of moving the goalpost and how people can sort of continually rationalize things that they have no good reason to continue to rationalize. So I think that's a great example. So Demon Hunter World, terrific book, essential reading. I absolutely love it, and it's fantastic. The next two are probably like with Demon Hunter World, not just two of my favorite atheist books, they're two of my favorite books, period. But we'll start with number two. Number two is, like The God Delusion, one of the most influential books on atheism ever written. I think it probably is in the stratosphere of probably millions of copies. It's been sold all over the world, and was one of this author's, I think, greatest achievements as a writer, and it is just fantastic. It is God is Not Great, How Religion Poisons Everything by the late, great Christopher Hitchens. Discovering Hitchens was a transformative experience for me. I remember there's a quote of Bob Dylan described hearing Elvis Presley for the first time as sort of breaking out of jail. It was like breaking out of jail. That's how I feel about the first time I ever really read Christopher Hitchens. The first book I ever read of his was The Missionary Position, which is all about the crimes and misdemeanors, if you will, of Mother Teresa of Calcutta and how she isn't so great. I think that book is amazing, and I've read most of his books over the years and his essays, and he's an incredible influence on me, both for my atheism but also for my writing. I was really influenced by just him as a writer. I love how he writes. I always describe to people, when you're reading a book by Christopher Hitchens, when you're reading something of Hitch, it's like reading 3 books in one, because you're going to get so much information in such a short amount of pages. But I think it's just a genuinely terrific book. But God is Not Great is one of his best, and I think it's an amazing book. So he sort of outlines the problems with religion, how the books are, from an era of superstition and from backwardness. He talks about how the Quran is largely plagiarized from the Bible. He talks about the crimes of religion. He also has this great chapter debunking common myths about atheism, like Stalin was an atheist and things like that, and sort of debunking some of the common rejoinders that are given to us as atheists. And it's just, I think, an amazing polemical tract that is worth reading, and especially for his language. I mean, he's one of the most brilliant writers who ever worked in the English language. So when you read Christopher Hitchens, it's an amazing experience, and it was for me. I mean, I read God is Not Great when I was 21. Yeah, I think I was like either a sophomore in college. And the book, I mean, I couldn't put it down. I remember reading it on my girlfriend's bed at the time, who's now my wife, and just enthralled, just constantly reading page after page after page, and just like, yes, this is a terrific book. This gets us exactly right about the problem of religion, that religion does poison everything. And, and he states it pretty bluntly about, I don't say that just as a pithy title. I mean to say that religion infects everything that we do, and for good or for ill, and it's mostly for ill. So I'm going to share with you now a couple quotes from God is Not Great. And one of them is critical of religion. One of them is a sort of defense of atheism and humanism. So here we go. Here's the first one. Quote, "One must state it plainly. Religion comes from the period of human prehistory where nobody, not even the mighty Democritus, who concluded that all matter was made from atoms, had the smallest idea what was going on. It comes from the bawling and fearful infancy of our species, and is a babyish attempt to meet our inescapable demand for knowledge, as well as for comfort, reassurance, and other infantile needs. Today, the least educated of my children knows much more about the natural order than any of the founders of religion, and one would like to think, though the connection is not a fully demonstrable one, that this is why they seem so uninterested in sending fellow humans to hell." It's a pretty damn good quote. Pretty damning of religion, and for good reason. I mean, I think religion's pretty crappy and pretty backward and harmful to human flourishing and progress. So I agree with Hitch on this 100%. I think it's terrific. And the fact that like religion is our first attempt of trying to understand the world. That's what religion was. It was an attempt at philosophy. It was an attempt at science. It was an attempt at history. It was an attempt at all the fields of investigation and inquiry that we use today to truly understand what's going on. And that's what it is. That's what myths are. That's what superstitions are. They're attempts for us to understand what's going on. And as we grow our knowledge, we realize that a lot of these myths and superstitions are just wrong. And some of them are harmful because they're built on bad ideas. So I think it's a good point to note that religion is something from the infancy of our species, as Hitch says. And to sort of abandon it, to take from it what works in terms of good ideas about humanism and human flourishing and culture. I think it's important to know religion culturally, because you can't understand a lot of literature or just common idioms without it. But beyond that, I don't really think it's, the Bible is not a history book. The Bible is not a science book. And the Bible is not really a great ethics book. There's so much in it that's both contradictory and just bad. And that's just, you can say the same about the Quran or any other sort of holy book. So I think it's true. I think that religion is sort of a primeval aspect of who we are that has been just continually rationalized through the generations. Doesn't make it any better, and certainly doesn't make it right. So I'm going to follow up with that quote with a quote of his about humanism and just atheists and sort of free thinkers in general. Quote, "Our belief is not a belief. Our principles are not a faith. We do not rely solely upon science and reason because they are necessary rather than sufficient factors, but we distrust anything that contradicts science or outrages reason. We may differ on many things, but what we respect is free inquiry, open-mindedness, and the pursuit of ideas for their own sake." I love that. That is literally the embodiment of being a secular humanist and being a free thinker, somebody who values reason and evidence and critical thinking and skepticism. I love it. So God is Not Great, Christopher Hitchens, I think it's an essential book. It's one of the all-time greats in atheism, and I recommend everybody read it. All right, here is number one. This is my all-time favorite book on atheism, period. All-time favorite. I love this book. I read this around the same time that I read a lot of these other books. It is still my favorite, by and large. Every time I go back to it, I learn something new, and I gain new insight, and I find myself referencing it all the time. And I'd love to get this author on the show. It's a possibility. We'll see if I can get him on the show. I'd love to. But it's an excellent, excellent book. It is Atheism, The Case Against God by George H. Smith. Intellectual historian George H. Smith, known for his really amazing column for libertarianism.org. He's a classical liberal scholar. He's written countless essays and books on classical liberalism, libertarianism, Ayn Rand, and he's just awesome. George H. Smith is a really cool guy, and I really hope to get him on the show. I'd love to. So we'll see. Maybe we'll get him on the show at some point. But Atheism, The Case Against God came out in the early 70s. It is, as I think the anniversary edition that came out a couple years ago, before there was the God delusion, before God is Not Great, there was this. This book is still one of the best books because The God Delusion is great, and so is God is Not Great. They're both excellent books, but they're very polemical, and some things they take as a given in terms of sort of critical thinking, science, things like that. George H. Smith works like an intellectual historian and a philosopher, and he goes through and philosophically outlines the case for atheism and for skepticism and reason, and uses philosophy to do it. He uses Ayn Rand, he uses objectivism, he uses sort of the classical liberal tradition alongside a lot of other scholars, and really outlines a case for atheism, for critical thinking, for reason, and against superstition, and against religion, and against God. He also has some terrific chapters towards the end about the problems of Christianity, and particularly the issues around the life of Jesus and around Jesus as a character. And I love it. There's a new edition of it that came out a couple years ago that has a new foreword by Lawrence Krauss. And it has an afterword by Smith, sort of reflecting on the book, over 40 years later. So it's a terrific, terrific book. I love it. And I think that for anybody who's new to atheism, if you are sort of a new to skepticism, or you're new to this space, or more importantly, you're somebody who's a believer, somebody who's not an atheist. If you want to know, if you want a book that's like, what is the best one book I can read that gives me a sense of what atheism is, I would recommend Atheism, the Case Against God, because I think it's the one volume book that will give you everything you need to know about sort of the basics of atheism. I love it. I absolutely love the book. I'm going to share with you one of my favorite quotes from it, and it's one that I think I've recently made into a meme for the site and for our Facebook. And I think it's exactly my view, one of my views of life, and I think it's terrific. I think it's towards the beginning of the book. I think it's in the first chapter in the introduction. So here we go. Quote, "It is my firm conviction that man has nothing to gain, emotionally or otherwise, by adhering to a falsehood, regardless of how comfortable or sacred that falsehood may appear. Anyone who claims, on the one hand, that he is concerned with human welfare, and who demands, on the other hand, that man must suspend or renounce the use of his reason, is contradicting himself. There can be no knowledge of what is good for man apart from knowledge of reality and human nature, and there is no manner in which this knowledge can be acquired except through reason. To advocate irrationality is to advocate that which is destructive to human life." I love that. I think that's exactly right. And the idea of advocating rationality, advocate what's destructive to human life, this very much echoes some of the ideas that Sam Harris would later discuss in The Moral Landscape. This is not just a sort of metaphysical position. This is a deeply moral position for why atheism is right, because reason is important. We can't gain knowledge about the world without understanding without using the capacity for reason. It's all we've got. We don't have faith. We don't have revealed knowledge. We don't have sort of pink beams of light going into our head is what supposedly happened to Philip K. Dick. We have reason. That's all we've got. Or we have just sort of our intuitions that are a part of us biologically, right? So it's a balance between that. But reason is the most important thing, and reason is how we gain knowledge. And using reason is the foundational part of what being an atheist is all about, for me anyway. And that's why my show is named Reason Revolution, because I think reason is so important. I think it's one of the foundational values of being an atheist, to being a humanist, to being a critical thinker and a skeptic. Doesn't mean we're Spock-like. Doesn't mean, we don't think about our emotions. We don't think about our intuitions. We don't think about those things. Those are important too. But reason is so important to understanding the world. It helps us be the best we can and to do the best we can. So I love that. To advocate irrationality is to advocate that which is destructive to human life. I think that's absolutely right. So that's the top 10 list. So here's some honorable mentions. These are some books that I really love. So I mentioned two already. Why Evolution is True by Jerry Coyne. That's excellent. Flim Flam by James Randi. Also, I mentioned before. God, the Failed Hypothesis by Dr. Vic Stanger. It's a great book. It's all about how what we know about science and particularly physics can teach us about the world, and how we can really just sort of abandon religion as understood by sort of the monotheisms. Life-Driven Purpose by Dan Barker. It's a play on Purpose-Driven Life by Rick Warren. That's a wonderful little book about how atheism and broadly humanism can be an affirmative worldview, and one that can sort of bring joy and wonder and happiness to your life because your life belongs to you. And then I wrote one down, but anything by Steven Pinker. I'm a huge Steven Pinker fan. I wrote down The Better Angels of Our Nature, which is all about human violence and how it's declined over the centuries, and sort of the rise of progress in our culture and our sort of global human culture. And it's a terrific book. The other book that I loved of his that I've read recently is The Blank Slate, The Modern Denial of Human Nature, which is, I think, another terrific masterwork of Pinker's, all about how there are sort of universal truths about human nature that we deny in culture because they're politically inconvenient. And I love Steven Pinker. He's got a new book coming out in February, which is sort of a sequel to The Better Angels of Our Nature. And I can't wait to unpack that book when I get it in the mail, because I got it on pre-order. So you can tell I love books. Books are my life in a lot of ways. They're one of the things that I absolutely live for and love. And I am so thrilled to have been able to take an episode this week and share some of my favorite books with you. If there's a book that I didn't mention that you really like, shoot it my way. Send us an email at reasonrevolutionpodcast@gmail.com or send us a message through the website, reasonrevolution.org. Let me know what books you're reading. What have you read that you liked that I didn't have on the list? Who are some authors that were really influential to you? And more importantly, how much are books a part of your life? Because I'd love to hear some feedback about, how much my listeners love books, because I have a feeling they probably do as much as I do. So yeah, definitely shoot us some feedback. I'd love to hear some books that might give me some suggestions for future reading. So that's it for this week. I'm going to leave you with another quote from Carl Sagan. It's actually about books, and I really loved it. So I'm going to leave you with this quote. Books, purchasable at low cost, permit us to interrogate the past with high accuracy, to tap the wisdom of our species, to understand the point of view of others and not just those in power, to contemplate with the best teachers the insights painfully extracted from nature of the greatest minds that ever were, drawn from the entire planet and form all of our history. They allow people long dead to talk inside our heads. Books can accompany us everywhere. Books are patient where we are slow to understand, allow us to go over the hard parts as many times as we wish, and are never critical of our lapses. Books are key to understanding the world and participating in a democratic society. And that's a wonderful insight about the power of books and why I love books, and I hope that you do too. That's it for Reason Revolution this week. Please subscribe to us on SoundCloud, iTunes, and YouTube. And now Google Play. We're on Google Play now too. If there's a platform you listen to podcasts on that I'm not on, please let me know and I will try to make it happen. Send us your feedback at reasonrevolutionpodcast@gmail.com. You can follow our Facebook page at facebook.com/reasonrevolution. Visit our brand new website, reasonrevolution.org, to keep up on all episodes, blogs, and additional content. If you would like to support our work, click on the support tab on our website. We just launched our new membership program. Join the revolution. You can join us for $2 a month or a little more if you want. You get free entrance into our monthly book giveaways. Receive as many entries as the amount you pay per month. We're going to be doing a quarterly live Q&A, which you can participate in, and it's just for Reason Revolution members. Admittance into our private Facebook group for further in-depth discussions on episodes and articles. You're going to get a free bookmark from us because I love books. I hope you love books too, and we're going to give you a bookmark too. 50% off our book group and early ticket purchase option. So we're going to be doing, I think in the summer, we haven't, I think, fully officially announced it yet, but we're going to be doing possibly a book group. You're going to get early entry into that. You're going to get half off of that. So definitely join us at reasonrevolution.org and you can hit the support tab. $2 a month gets you all kinds of cool stuff. One other thing we're going to think about doing as well is a private one-on-one live stream with me. So if you join, you can, request either once a month or whenever. You can request a one-on-one live stream with me. And if you want to turn that into an episode for the podcast, we can certainly do that as well. So definitely consider joining us and supporting us. Your support is what helps make us possible. You can follow me on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, Tumblr, and YouTube at The Daily Clark. Until next week, this has been Justin Clark, and this has been Reason Revolution.